Aditya Davda says, why are there so many civil wars in the Middle East and Africa? Well, you have to ask yourself, who is the major power in the Middle East? And who is the major power in Africa? Once again, let's go to the map. So when it comes to the Middle East, you have, you can call it the Middle East, or you can call it West Asia, whatever you want to call it. The major power in this region is the United States of America. Okay, they have typically the, you can see all these straight line borders over here, which were drawn by the British and the Americans in the first half of the 20th century. And in the past 70, 80 years, it is the Americans who have been the major power here. And if this region is in turmoil, you have to ask yourselves how that happened. The Middle East is always in crisis. Why is it so? Who creates these crises? And now that the American influence is declining in this region, why is the Middle East stabilizing? Why are Iran and Saudi Arabia shaking hands now? In case some of you watched my podcast with Velina Chakarova, she herself said this, that US influence in West Asia or the Middle East, whatever you call it, is declining and the region is now stabilizing. I think one leads to the other. One has clearly led to the other. The stabilization has happened because US influence in this region is declining. And their interest is declining because they no longer need Saudi oil. Similarly, ask yourself, who is the major power in Africa? So when it comes to Western Africa, much of it is, you could say, still de facto colonized by France. And when it comes to the remaining nations in Africa, many of them are very strongly under US influence. Right? And these nations have propped up lots of dictatorships in Africa for the past 70, 80 years at least, ever since colonization officially ended, more or less. But they have kept these Africa in turmoil, in strife. And they have also done lots of regime change operations. When somebody comes up, see, you know what happens in Africa? What happens in Africa? Africa is being used to produce consumer crops for the West. So all these nations in Africa, they have so much fertile soil. They have such wonderful resources. Yeah. But none of these African nations grows rice or wheat. They grow exotic crops like coffee and other things, which are all exported to the West. So the West gets what it wants, and in return, it supplies rice and wheat, etc., to the African nations. And God forbid some African president decides that we should now stop, growing cocoa and all these crops and start growing rice and wheat for ourselves. Something happens and this guy gets knocked off. So because African nations are not allowed to grow their own crops, they're always forever dependent on the West for feeding their people. And if they implement certain policies that the West does not like, the West can starve them on demand. And there are these nations in Western Africa which all use the French franc or various African versions of the French franc, which are printed in France, and the French they charge money for printing the currency. So Africa is still colonized, and that's why it is because of the malign influence of the West that there are so many civil wars in the Middle East, in Africa, and why Africa is so deeply impoverished despite being so incredibly resource rich. There are nations in Africa they produce enormous amounts of gold, but these nations have zero gold reserves. So where does all the gold go? Ask yourselves. Colonization has never ended, and the West is still destroying these nations. Understand these things. Your history teacher will not teach you any of this. Most likely your history teacher doesn't even know about this. And if they know, they will not teach you. Why? Ask yourself. Why? Because they want to fool you. They want you to live in a make-believe world and not understand how the real world works.